Hi, everybody. Welcome to Sex, Lies, and Cursing. Isn't this a great class? Where else do you get something like that along with your readings? Okay, before we go on and I talk about the topics that I've outlined here, I wanted to take just a second here to look at these pictures that I put up and to freeze my camera. There we go. All right, we've frozen with the traditional goofy smile. The two top pictures are the ones that I'm interested in just spending a moment for. Now, obviously, there's a pragmatic reason that I used a picture of the women from Sex and the City. One is that when I look for pictures to illustrate ideas or words, that was probably the only clean one that I could use to illustrate the word sex. But much more importantly, I've been thinking a lot about the fact that the kind of prevalence and openness of dealing with sexuality in The Thin Man and also in Farewell My Lovely really is setting the stage for where we end up with a TV show that is about sex and sexuality, along with a lot of other things. And that puts women in control of a lot of their sexuality, examines their choices. And oddly enough, if we look at The Thin Man, we really see kind of a prototype of that kind of anything goes, willingness to talk, portrayal of sex and sexuality and the different ways it plays out depending on individuals. The other picture that I thought was wonderful is when I did a Google image search for using the word lies, I came up with this little piece of art, which I thought was just wonderful. It's as a picture that has a number of common lies that we put out either in politeness or in cowardice, or that we tell to ourselves. So one of my favorites is at the bottom. It says the diet starts tomorrow, and then there's sort of the some of the universal ones, like the one that's towards the top that says one size fits all, and there's another one, you haven't changed a bit, that looks good on you. All these things that we kind of recognize when we read them, like, oh yeah, I've heard that one before. Or that we might accept from somebody else, and with a wink and a nudge, knowing that it is a lie, and yet it's kind of an acceptable one. And this plays into something that I'm going to talk about with a little bit more depth later in this presentation, the issue of lying and lies in The Thin Man. So I'm hoping that you're able to see when I move this screen, because I don't think that you have control over the material in the right-hand side. If you do, then just scroll down. If you don't, hopefully you can see it. Please email me if you're not able to see either see or move the material on the right-hand side of the screen, because I'll need to find a different way of doing this if that's true. First of all, I wanted to say about The Thin Man what I've been reiterating. It is an interesting contrast to Poe and Conan Doyle, and I've really been pointing out the differences, and you've picked up on those too. Wow, what a culture shock. It really wasn't that much time that's passed, but it seems almost as if we're in a different universe, a different world. I have 2 points to make about this. First of all, it's really important to recognize that The Thin Man and Farewell My Lovely represent only one strain of detective fiction. The world of Sherlock Holmes and what we learned about, the thing called the cozy, the locked room, and the omnipotent or skillful detective, that world still exists. It still exists today. But we have practitioners like Dorothy Sayers and Agatha Christie writing at the same time that Hammett and Chandler and some of the later people are writing. They're writing at the same time and turning out completely different kinds of detective fiction. Some of that we're reading, some of that we're not. When we come to P.D. James, who we'll be reading after Raymond Chandler, we'll see that, in fact, she does write the more traditional kind of mystery. Well, we're just looking at one strain here, but it's very important because it's not just that these were really popular and that they had a tremendous effect on how people wrote detective fiction, but also because they're urban, because they came out in magazines that everybody read, and people, people who were interested in pulp fiction, and they had a tremendous readership and impact on how people saw the art of detection, and also they provide a tremendous amount of commentary on the world that exists at the time they're being written. Okay, that said, the influence of those precursors is evident everywhere in the story. We see Poe and Conan Doyle all over the place, although you may not think of this. I want to give you two examples. First of all, we have the fact that there is still a detective, and he does still arrive at a conclusion, which he reveals in the end, through basically a speech. This happened, then that happened, and here's what was going on. We have a villain. It's important because in Farewell, My Lovely, the idea of a villain becomes a little bit more difficult. But we still have a villain, and he's still somebody we don't feel sorry for at all. He kills out of greed, and then to protect himself. He has no interest in. There's absolutely nothing to make it okay that he does these things, that he commits all the crimes that he does. Right? But the second thing I wanted to point out is that Gilbert, Nora, and in particular, are steeped in the idea that a detective and the detective's work follows the model of Sherlock Holmes. This is what detection is. It was what Sherlock Holmes did. He knew beyond a shadow of a doubt. He was able to figure everything else out. Now, we have these, what we refer to as cultural artifacts, remnants from these earlier models of what a detective looks like, and they come up against what Nick says about detection, which is basically it's a dirty business, and you don't always know. You do your best, and that's all you can hope for. And hopefully, the guy comes out and he's and it turns out he's guilty, or the woman. So I just wanted to point those two things out, that it's not like we completely left Conan Doyle and Poe behind. They're still there, and without them, the story would be a very different one. Another thing is that I wanted to say this is a perfect companion piece for Farewell, My Lovely, for some obvious reasons and for some not so obvious reasons. One of them is that both Farewell, My Lovely and The Thin Man are urban detective novels. They are set in big cities, and the fact of those cities, the life, the culture, the reality of urban life are inextricable from how those stories unfold. Now, obviously, the contrast is that New York is the home of the Thin Man, or the setting for the Thin Man, and there are realities of New York society and expectations and beliefs and landmarks, and New York belongs to the United States in a different way than Los Angeles, which is where Farewell, My Lovely is set, in a very different way than Los Angeles does. Los Angeles, even at the time certainly at the time when Carver is writing Farewell, My Lovely, is the home of the movies, of illusion, of it's a new city, it's a strange city, compared with New York, which has been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. But they're both urban, and they both follow, as I was suggesting just a little while ago, they both follow this particular path, which I'll talk about a little bit later, about the noir path, this idea of crime and the difficulty and the lack of knowability, the anonymity that cities provide. They both sort of go down that path. Both of these feature a private detective. Now, in the case of Charles, he's supposedly no longer practicing, and he basically spends most of his time not working as a detective, even when he's trying to unravel this mystery. He sort of goes around having drinks with people to figure out what's going on. He does get shot. We have to grant him that. On the other hand, we look at Marlowe, and Marlowe is he does his job, and he's much more down on the ground level, getting drugged and beaten and shot at, and all the other things that happen to him. Nevertheless, there is a strong family resemblance between Charles and Marlowe, and these are things that go together very well. Now, one thing to think about as we're making this transition between The Thin Man and Farewell My Lovely is about the authors themselves. Hammett writes basically what might be termed a comedy of manners. In other words, it really looks at, and to some extent pokes fun of, upper class society. Hammett is really writing as an entertainer. This is to an extent, this is a pretty light story. It's not something that grapples with the fundamental questions of life and with questions of existential dread and things like that. By the time we get to Carver, we really do see Carver is a very different kind of writer, and he does grapple with some of those questions, and he does go farther down the dark path. There are some very chilling and oddly uplifting things in Farewell My Lovely. The Thin Man is just a lot of fun and some interesting psychology. All right, so let's talk about psychology. Let's talk about sexuality a little bit. And I hope you don't think I'm obsessed with this, but it's such a fascinating thing to me to look at what place this very fundamental and important human activity and identity takes in each of these novels, because the place that sexuality takes is a great determiner of who our villains and who our heroes are. Okay? And we'll talk a lot about that in Farewell My Lovely as well. All right. So as I've been suggesting, there is this huge difference, quantum leap, in talking about sexuality, in the presence of sexuality in The Thin Man, compared to any of the Sherlock Holmes or the Edgar Allan Poe. We have hints of it, but the way that it's framed and what we're given is very, very different. And the idea that sex and sexuality play any role in the story is a huge change. But some of this we can sort of take back to the societal changes that I was talking about. And some of those were things like women's suffrage, women getting the vote. During World War I, women starting to work outside the home, even middle-class women working outside the home, either as volunteers or actually being paid to do factory work and to do jobs that were traditionally done by men, because all men were gone. This is more so, by the way, in Britain than in America, but there was still, huge change during as we go through the 1920s. That we really see this playing out. Women's opportunities and expectations broaden. But I want to look at something that I've referred to a couple of times before, and because I don't think we can overestimate the impact that the bringing of psychoanalysis and the idea of psychology into the mainstream has upon the practice of sexuality. Because what Freud does is, we can't just limit it to Freud. We can talk about Jung, and there are many practitioners both abroad and in the United States of psychology. There are many people writing and publishing, just as there are today, about various things about psychology and reality and things like that. But the idea that it became part of mainstream popular culture, and that we adopted its vocabulary, is this incredible thing. The things that we take for granted now, that we can talk about, I'm going to go out and hook up, whatever. The idea that we would discuss these things, or how we were feeling regarding sexuality or choices, that is a huge change. It's simply not what people in polite society talked about. Of course, people talked about it, but it was not part of the common discourse. It was not something you would read about in the newspaper or in the magazine, unless there was, a horrible rape or a murder or some other kind of thing that involved victimization and crime. But I'm talking about people considering their sexuality as something that's important and central to their identity. And this is one of the things that Freud pioneered and is very famous for. I want to kind of give you an analogy. In the Middle Ages, people did not generally they did not keep diaries. They wrote letters, those who were educated, and this was usually, only the upper classes and certain people in religious orders were educated enough to write. But they wrote letters, but they didn't keep diaries, and the reason why is fascinating. It was because the idea of the self had not evolved to the point where people felt they should be keeping a record of their own doings, that those were important enough to record. The idea was that the self was less important than the community, than the group, than who you belonged with and what you were part of. So think about that tremendous transition that had to, that culturally people had to undergo in order to get to the point where they were writing about themselves and talking about themselves and about their experiences as individuals. Well, it's the same kind of sea change with sex and sexuality. And when you see in the book them talking about incest, about an illegitimate child, about people's affairs with one another, about possibly homosexuality, all sorts of things. When you see them talking about this, and it's just right all out there on the page, as if this novel had been written last week instead of many, many years ago, you would get a sense of the impact that psychoanalysis has on the ability to talk about this. Now, let's talk about the uses of sexual attention and power, and sexual power. There are a couple of things that are really worthy of note in this, in The Thin Man. One of them is Mimi and what she does with sex. She's described as sex mad. Nick calls her sex mad, and as if she were a nymphomaniac. I would suggest that she is anything but. In fact, I think that there's this wonderful thing that Nick says later, which in and of itself is shocking, where he says, he said, your mother hates men more than any woman I've ever known who wasn't a lesbian. Now, we'll set aside the misunderstanding of the idea that all lesbians hate men. That's a misconception, but we'll set that aside for a moment and just look at that at that statement, because I think that that's really very true. Mimi doesn't use sex because she likes sex. She uses sex because it's a weapon and a tool. She uses it to get what she wants, just as Dory on her level does the same thing. But the thing is that Mimi is a master manipulator, a liar, and a person who's willing to do anything to take care of herself. She doesn't even care about her kids. But the one thing that she wants is to take care of number one. She's basically a sociopath, and again, sex is her weapon. I don't know if any of you felt this, but every time she and Nick were in a room together, I thought Hammett did a wonderful job of creating this unbelievable tension. We know they had been lovers, and we gradually find out, with hardly any doubt, that Dory is actually Nick's daughter. And we know that they've been close. And the thing that Hammett does is you keep thinking, this horrible woman is going to win Nick over. He's going to succumb. They're going to become lovers again. It's going to be awful. Oh, please don't be a fool. Don't be an idiot. And I think that this tension, Hammett is just a master of using that tension between them to really keep to keep us kind of glued to the page, even though some of these people are generally pretty silly. And we don't really care that much about them. I mean, we don't really care what happens to them. We like Nick and Nora. They're great. But they're not people that we, after we read the book, we sit up and think about, oh boy, I hope fictionally their lives continue good. And you will find that in some of the books that you read, that you will really become attached to the characters and interested in them and imagine, well, what would it be like if this happened to them and things like that. But so the tremendous use of sexual tension and the idea that sex is a way of obtaining power is everywhere in this book, everywhere. We see the ability to resist when Nick resists Mimi, which he does several times. He takes her hand off him. He says, "No, I'm not really that interested. No, I won't come up." When he goes to see her, he generally tries to bring somebody. It seems like everybody's always trying to get Nick alone in a room. We see that play between that play of ideas, the pull and the push of sexual tension, is an incredible tool to advance the plot. I'll come back to this later, but we're going to see that more and more, is that this idea of attraction, repulsion, the exercise of sexual power. Think about the power that Mimi has over the policeman and over many of the people that she meets. That this is something that really becomes central in many of the novels that we meet. The other thing to be aware of is that Mimi is our first femme fatale, the deadly woman, and we'll meet, and that's kind of a standard issue of many detective novels. We'll certainly see one again in Death of the Expert Witness. There's a great one in Farewell, My Lovely, and there actually you'll think there's two, but it's fascinating that when we get to the end of The Thin Man, really all of Mimi's manipulatings and connivings end up to be nothing to a certain extent. I mean, she does end up with what she really wanted, which was the money. But think about how she herself is duped. Her sexual power ends up being short-circuited. And I would ask that you look for that in stories. You look for that. I don't know if you recall, but I was talking about the new woman and this model that comes out of the late 1800s of the woman who chooses either not to be married and to pursue a career, or who is in a marriage but she's bored and she's having affairs with other men. This model of the new woman, the way that you could write about a woman like that, a woman who wasn't traditional, is you had to somehow punish her. And so in the end, her power was or is kind of beaten down and taken away, either by frustration or madness, or she does get married off. And there's something similar that happens with the femme fatale. Again, think about this. Remember, we were looking way back when we were reading Poe. We were looking at this attraction to the other, that we have this love-hate relationship with the other, but we come so close to that embrace of something that's foreign and strange and doesn't fit the model. And it compels us. It's exotic, it's exciting, it's interesting, and yet it's also fearsome. So something has to happen in the story to quell that, or come to it. Now, in the case of The Thin Man and Farewell, My Lovely, we don't succumb to it. We don't have a sense that evil with a small e, or the bad people got away with their crime. But he gets punished and order is sort of reasserted, kind of. So I think that we're going to continue to be looking at how sexual tension and sexual power come into play in all the books that we're reading. I want to move on to talk a little bit about the lying liars and the lies they tell. As I suggested before, there's so much uncertainty in the Thin Man. There's so much, and I wanted to say it's not just evident in outright lying that people do to each other. It's also evident in all the half-finished sentences. There's that great conversation between Nick and Flint, where he's saying, "Oh, she's a cute girl." You're talking about Dory. I sure hope your wife doesn't. And Nick says, "No, she's all right." And that's the point where we go, where it's confirmed for us that Dory is Nick's daughter, his illegitimate daughter that he fathered with Mimi during their affair. So there's all this stuff, and these end up being lies because you're left to guess. You have that loss of certainty. I mean, at certain points in the novel, I wanted to know, would you just finish a sentence, please, once? But Hammett does it enough that you know it's not that he didn't know how the sentence ends. It's that this is another way that he draws the reader in and he makes you finish that sentence. Or be mystified and say, you know, do these people know? What is there a truth here? How can we find it? Okay, so that's one way. The other thing, there are things that absolutely aren't said, even when everyone knows them. And this is another, you know, there are things about people's drinking, about drug use, about what mobsters really do, about just all sorts of things that are basically lies. I have to tell you a funny story about the things that go unsaid. I was recently in a bar, and by golly, one of the students in this class turned out to be the bartender. And we were talking about the hard drinking life that these people live, and just the partying and the crazy hours and all this stuff. And the student had a great observation. She said, look, how could they keep it up? And as I'm sipping on my Sapphire on the Rocks, I said, you know, you're right. That's really pretty. That's actually a brilliant point, because this is one of the things that doesn't get said, is that this lifestyle is going to kill them. Hammett is portraying a world, an impermanent world. It's not, you know, Britannia rule the waves forever. We know these people are going to get old and die because they're already half the time so hungover and sick from their drinking that they, you know, you think, wow, I wonder how you're going to get through this. These are people who are living self-destructively. They're living dangerously. They're being wild and free and relatively young. But you do have the sense that they're sort of dancing on the edge of the volcano, and at any point they're going to fall in. This is an unreal, unsecure life. And it's the thing that people don't say. And then there's, of course, that element of denial. I found one of the most chilling and fascinating comments in this, in the Thin Man, was the point where Mimi says, if you want the girl, take her, but don't get sentimental about it. And unless you've picked up that Dory is Nick's daughter, you realize that you think that she's basically pimping her daughter to Nick. But what's so striking about this comment is that it lays bare the fact that Nick has never taken an interest in his daughter. He's never been involved with her. It's sort of unclear whether she knows that he's her father. There's this kind of, this is one of the gray areas, one of the places of uncertainty and unknowability, is Dory seeking a father figure? Is that why she's kind of camping out? Or does she have some kind of weird Oedipal attraction to Nick? Or, you know, there's just all kinds of questions about it. So anyway, the other thing, which I was referring to earlier, is that lying in the world that Hammett gives us appears to be, to some extent, socially acceptable. It's expected that people will lie. There's the issue with the Quinns, and they're having love affairs and or that Quinn is going off and sleeping with people and she just says, I know about this, and it's everybody kind of accepts it. It's not like Quinn is shunned, or when he shows up at a party with Dory that people go, man, about your wife. Just kind of say, oh well, boys will be boys. And there are all kinds of things like that in the book. And what I would suggest is when we're looking at a story, one of the questions we can usefully ask is, what do the expectations and the things that people accept, what do those tell us about the culture and the society of that produced this book? I can give you an example actually from Farewell My Lovely, is what do we learn about how our narrator, Marlowe, refers to African Americans, how our author, Chandler, portrays them in that opening scene. Think about that and what that's telling us about racism and the attitudes, not just of the narrator, but of the author as well. So it's just something to think about, what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, and how that takes us back out of the novel into the world that generated it. Okay. One strand, as I suggested, that's represented by the Thin Man and Farewell My Lovely, is this thing that we would call noir. And noir is a French word. It means black, and it's sort of this dark sensibility. It was a kind of detective fiction and then film that followed down a path where it was urban, it was gritty, there was violence, there was open sexuality. There was also a subset of noir literature which dealt not with a detective but with a victim or a criminal. And basically it was, but anyway, the idea of the noir detective novel is that there is a sense that on some level there is no truth, or that truth is meaningless, or, as we see with Mimi, truth is a movable thing. It's an apparatus that changes according to what she needs. She moves the truth. Well, this time I'm really telling the truth. This is the truth. And what's so fascinating is that every time she changes her story, it's plausible, and it keeps presenting a different reality to the people trying to unravel the case. So going back to this, there's this morality that you can't know. That in a sense, that the world is built on lies, and the best a person can hope for is to arrive at some sort of equilibrium where you know something, even if that something is just a bottle of whiskey and a gun, because nothing else will really remain the same. There's again this sense that even what you can touch and see and hear may not be real. Now think about the contrast between that and what we saw in Poe and in Conan Doyle. There's much more a sense of we can know, can find out. Through the exercise of our mental powers, we can have an effect on this. One thing, I want to stress again, this is one strain of detective fiction. It's not the only one. There were others that dealt with much more with the closed world, as I like to call it. And we'll read some more recent ones, particularly the Ellis Peters novel, which there's a tremendous sense of knowability and that things can be unraveled. Okay, so this is just one strain. It's a wonderful strain, and it's one that I really love, particularly as it's played out in Hammett and Carver. But it's just one. One other thing I wanted to say before we move on to the last little bit about cursing is that the idea, something that we haven't really talked about, which is that I discussed the impact that World War I had on so many of particularly the men who were involved with it. It was so unbelievably traumatic for the people who lived through it. It was, and people came back from the war with a real sense of disillusionment, and in addition to the shell shock and the horror and the injuries and all that kind of stuff, the real sense of disillusionment and an erosion of confidence that held lives together: religion, government, duty, honor, service, the value of human life, the idea that there was a purpose in what one did and that it was good and just to sacrifice for one's country. Did anyone notice that Nick Charles is a veteran of World War I? There's a little thing in early or about midway through the book where Nick tells Nora, Macaulay is saying that Nick saved my life, and he says, "Oh no, phooey, I didn't do that. We were in a foxhole, which is a trench, war, and Macaulay's a bad shot, misses the guy who's trying to shoot him, and Nick takes him out." Well, and that turns out to be a wonderful clue about why Julia Wolf and her telephone got shot so much. But the presence of Nick, who's lived through these things, is kind of like a little marker of this unknown. And the World War I veteran often figures in the earlier film noir and noir literature that we read. And so there's that sense of uncertainty, unknowability, despair, fear, all those things. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about cursing. As I noted in the announcement, this big change is that good people using bad language is okay. I don't know if you jumped a little bit when a couple of people go, balls, oh, balls, like, whoa, really? Are you really saying that? That's shocking. But it's not just that. It's like calling somebody a bitch and talking about using drugs. And when Alice says, what do you think about Quinn chasing anything that's hot and hollow? Well, that's pretty raw stuff. And it gives you a sense of what's going on culturally in that moment. Nice people, educated, in the upper class with money, are appropriating, which means borrowing and then using as their own language that does not belong to them, language that comes from the lower class, language that comes from the criminal classes. And we get a sense of that cultural moment where it's seen as dangerous and dashing and wild to very interesting. Those moments, there's a real shock value even now. One thing I wanted to kind of challenge you, and I do this in the announcement too, is does this remind you of anything? Think about all the Caucasian people you know who say to one another, "What up, homie?" or whatever phrase of the day you can say that people borrow from that people borrow from music or from some other from a show or from something that they see. That this idea of cultural appropriation, going out into another culture and taking it and bringing it in, is something that we do just as much as we see happening in the novels some of the novels that we're going to read. What this comes back to is this thing. This is another example of this love-hate affair with the other. This idea that these people, these upper-class people who have lots of money, can then go and sit down in a speakeasy and rub shoulders with gangsters, and it's fun, and the gangsters are cute, and that there's a certain rough grace to a lot of the gangsters that we encounter. That somehow there's some kind of there's maybe at least with study, there's maybe this kind of sense of honor and duty that may have been sucked out of one part of society. The fact that this can go on is another example of one group, of the dominant group, reaching out to the other, even as they punish and contain the other, and as they push it away. Obviously, criminals are bad. What we find, though, and this goes back to what I was talking about with the lies and the liars, is that as morals and cultural and social certainty erodes, it becomes easier to make that negotiation. We start, the people in control start looking outwards at the other and wondering if perhaps they have something that has been lost. Is it out there? And that's, you keep going. I mean, think about what certain people do to Native American culture and the shaman and how sometimes white culture has romanticized Native American culture and sort of made it like, these are the people who are spiritually whole. If you go to them, then you can be healed. If you follow their ways, then you can be healed and somehow find something that you've lost by being, involved in modern society. All right, so those are just some notes that I wanted to pass along to you about the Thin Man. I'm looking forward to talking to you about